Hi, this is Mr. Arthur, and today will be part one of two parts covering a new topic, which is inheritance and variation. I'm mostly going to look at variation today. So, to begin with, I wanted to first of all define what we mean by a species in biology. If you take two organisms that look the same, do you know that if they're the same species or not? Or sometimes members of the same species can look quite different. So, how do we define what a species is? Well, basically, if the two organisms are able to interbreed, and produce fertile offspring, that means they are still the same species. If you take two organisms and they do interbreed, but the offspring which is produced is infertile, then we'll classify them as being different species. So a good example of this, if you think about dogs, different dogs look very, very different, but they are still the same species, dog, canines, because the offspring they produce are fertile and can produce further offspring, okay? So they're just the same species, but they have very different physical appearances. On the right here, if you look at a horse and a donkey, they look quite similar, but are they the same species? Well, if you interbreed a horse with a donkey, there is offspring produced, and that offspring is called a mule. And unsurprisingly, the mule looks like both its parents, because it's a cross. However, a mule cannot mate with another mule to produce fertile offspring, okay? The mule's like a dead end. So the offspring is not fertile, therefore horses and donkeys are classified as being different species. So they can produce, sometimes different species can still produce a hybrid offspring, but because the hybrid offspring isn't fertile, we classify them as being different species, not the same. So variation is a term that we use to describe the differences within a species. And we're mostly talking about the physical differences here, how different they look. If you look at the giraffes here, these giraffes are all of the same species, but within this population, there's quite a bit of variation. They'll vary in height, they're varying in colour, and they're varying in the camouflage patterns that they have on their skin. So there is variation within the same species. These butterflies are still the same species because they can interbreed to produce fertile offspring, but there's massive variation between the different groups within the same species. And again, if we look at these different tigers, you can see that facially they have different physical appearances, different colours of eyes, different widths of nose. So there's differences in the physical characteristics. We call this variation. However, they are still the same species. Okay, there's two types of variation, discrete variation and continuous variation. Let's deal with discrete first of all. You need to know the definition of a discrete variation. We define it as when the physical appearances cannot be measured in a range. So what I mean is there's no distinct order to it, but they can be measured into distinct groups or categories. For example, dimples or no dimples. You either have dimples or you don't. You can't measure how much dimples you have. You either have it or don't have it. If you look at your hairline, a lot of people have a straight hairline across their scalp, but some folk have a widow's peak. That's that kind of vampire look when you have the big peak coming down towards the nose. Earlobes in humans tend to either be attached or detached. So the earlobe is either attached into the side of the head or it's not. So again, it's either measured as being in one group or the other. Hair colour is a good example of this as well, or eye colour. You can either be brown-eyed or blue-eyed or green-eyed. What you can't be put into is a measurable range, okay? You can put those in any order, but they're groups. Same with fur colour. Now compare that with continuous variation. Again, continuous variation is differences in physical appearances, but these can all be measured in a range from a minimum to a maximum. So for humans, there's a minimum height of humans, okay? Even with dwarfism, there's a minimum height, and then there's a maximum height. Even with giantism, you can only get so high for the human species, okay? So that's a measurable range. The hand span, so when you open up your fingers, from the tip of your pinky to the tip of your thumb, that will vary from person to person, but there'll be a minimum and a maximum range. Similar with weight, you can have very light humans and even obese, overweight humans, but there's still a measurable range. And if you think about birds like bats or birds, there'll be different wingspans. Some species have huge wingspans, like the golden eagle, and other things like a robin will have quite a small wingspan. But the wingspan within the same species is a measurable difference, and it's measurable from a minimum to a maximum. Whereas if you thought about the eye colours within a species, they can be measured, but they're measured into different groups. They're not arranged in a maximum to minimum line. So that's the difference between discrete and continuous variation. So if you look at this one, is this an example of discrete, i.e. it's different groups, or is this a measurable range from a minimum to a maximum, making it continuous? So this, you're either one group or the other, so we call this an example of discrete variation, okay? Differences in physical appearances in the population. The wingspan of this bat, what type of variation is this? This is continuous variation because you're measuring it from a minimum to a maximum. Again, here we have different heights of different famous people. Height is measurable from a minimum here on the far left to a maximum on the far right. This makes it a continuous range of variation. So this is continuous variation. This is the widow's peak when the hairline dips forward like that in the centre. So either you have widow's peak or you do not have widow's peak. Therefore, this is an example of discrete variation because it's measured into distinct groups. Okay, so where does all this variation come from? Well, we look at this more in cell biology in Unit 1, but basically DNA is the code which determines your physical appearance. Your code is very long and it's divided up into different sections called genes, and of course you inherit your genes from your parents. We define a gene as being a section of your DNA which codes for a specific protein. Every gene has a different order of bases. So you look at the picture here, you can see there's different letters, but actually there's only 4 types of letter. These letters are bases. So your DNA is made up of A, T, G's and C's. Everybody's DNA has that. In fact, every animal on this planet has those same 4 bases in the DNA. The differences in different species is how much of the DNA you have, so how many bases, and importantly the order of the bases. Just like a sentence. So the gene for insulin might be ATAGCT, but the gene for glucagon might be GCGCTA. So it's the same bases, but every gene has a different order of bases. And because a gene codes for a protein, proteins are made of amino acids. If the gene has a different order of bases, the protein will have a different order of amino acids. The genes that you have inherited, or we call this your genotype. So it's your genes that determine what you look like. So your genotype determines your phenotype, which is your physical appearance. You can remember this because it starts with PH, which is also how you start the word physical. So genotype is your genes that you have, phenotype is your physical appearance. Okay, that was variation. Now we're going to look at inheritance. When we're talking about inheritance, we're talking about not the physical appearance, but the genes that are being inherited, which determine the physical appearance. So the type of inheritance also determines if the phenotype displays a continuous variation or discrete variation. So the two are closely linked but are different things. So inheritance is to do with the genes. If it's a single gene inheritance, that means the physical appearance is determined by just a single gene. That always causes discrete variation. So for example, either you have the gene for widow's peak or you do not. Either you have the gene for freckles or you do not. So it's nice and simple, okay? So any type of single gene inheritance always causes the discrete variation when you can categorize into groups. So the gene for hair color, if you inherit the redhead gene, you're going to have red hair. If you inherit the blonde gene, you're going to have blonde hair. Now, the other type of inheritance is polygenic. Polygenic simply means several genes. So this several gene inheritance causes continuous variation. That's because it's more complex. Because you get a combination of several different genes which you inherit, that determines where in the range you are between the minimum and maximum. So let's look at single gene inheritance. Because it's caused by one gene, it always causes discrete variation. So in this picture on the chromosome, there is only one gene which decides if you have this condition or not. So you can be affected or unaffected. Okay? You either have it or you don't have it. Now, on the key, you actually notice what it says, unaffected, affected, or carrier. And that's because for every gene, you have 2 versions. So it's still a single gene that's there, but because you inherit a copy of that single gene from your mum and a copy of the same gene from your dad, you actually have 2 copies of every gene. But this is still caused by a single gene. So in the bottom row, the unaffected son has inherited the blue version and the blue version. The daughter has actually inherited both versions, but you only display one. Okay? So therefore she's okay. She's also inherited the unaffected gene, so that's the one that works for her. Same with the carrier son. On the far right, the affected daughter has inherited the white version of the gene from both parents, so she is affected. So if we put it into two groups, the carriers and the unaffected, they're all unaffected by it. The carrier just means they actually carry the mutation, the disease-causing gene, but they're not affected by it. So those three are all in the unaffected group. The affected daughter is now a different group. So this is why we call it discrete variation. You either have or don't have it. And that's always caused by a single gene inheritance. If you get the blue version, you will not get the condition. If you get the white version from both parents, you do get the condition. So single gene inheritance causes discrete variation. Polygenic's more complex. Now in this example here, let's keep it simple and say, okay, well there's just two genes. So as soon as it's more than one, it's not single gene, it's polygenic. So say for example this chromosome, there's two genes which determine the width of the nose. So imagine it's a minimum of 12 millimeters to a maximum of 24 millimeters. Now even in this simple version, when there's only two genes involved, you could either have a capital A and a capital B version of the gene. We call this alleles, which we'll use more soon. So you could have a capital A from one parent and a capital B, for gene 1 you could have a capital A, and for gene 2 you could have a capital B. And so imagine if you get both of those genes, then you're going to have a really wide nose. If you get a capital A for the first gene and a lowercase b for the second gene, it's only 20 mil. If you get a lowercase a and a capital B, that combination would give you 16. And a small a and a small b will give you 12 mil. So you can see when it's polygenic, it just simply means there's more than one gene involved. And even with looking at two different genes, there's more combinations, which is why it always leads to a measurable range of phenotypes. And that's why polygenic inheritance always causes continuous variation. So polygenic just means that the variation is caused by inheriting several genes. So polygenic is the type of inheritance and it causes continuous variation. Now it's really important you answer the question. Pupils often mix these up if you're being asked about inheritance or being asked about variation, because the two are linked. You have to remember that single gene and discrete variation go together, and you have to remember polygenic inheritance and continuous variation go together. But you need to be clear in a question. Is it asking about the type of inheritance or is it asking about the type of variation? So the first example question says, which type of inheritance causes different wingspans? Now you might just see your wingspans, that's measurable min to maximum. So you might think that's an example of continuous variation. And it is, but that's not the answer to what's been asked. You were asked what's the type of inheritance, and that means genes, so it's caused by polygenic inheritance. The second example, having a dimpled chin or not having a dimpled chin, is an example of what? Well, there are two groups here, having a dimpled chin and not having a dimpled chin. So either you have one allele or you have the other. So this is caused by a single gene inheritance, but that's not what's being asked. Having a dimpled chin is an example of a phenotype, and as this is measurable into groups rather than to a minimum to a maximum range, it's an example of discrete variation. So just be careful what's being asked in a question. Make sure you know which ones pair together, but make sure if you're talking about what's been inherited, and that's the types of genes, the number of genes involved, or variation, which is about the physical appearances. This is a summary of what you need to know for the first part of the unit then. You need to be able to do a comparison of discrete variation caused by single gene inheritance and compare that to continuous variation caused by polygenic inheritance. Combining genes from two parents contributes to that variation within a species. So sexual reproduction leads to variation within a species because you're getting different versions of the same gene from each parent. Single gene inheritance of characteristics always show discrete variation, which means, and this is the SQA definition, they can be measured, so they're still measured, but they're measured into distinct groups. Polygenic inheritance, when there's several genes involved, always causes characteristics or phenotypes which have continuous variation, meaning that there's a range of values between a minimum and a maximum.